The autumn wind howled across the barren fields of Millbrook Valley, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke and something far more sinister. Jake Morrison pulled his weathered hat down against the gusts as he guided his horse through the twisted remains of what had once been the old Hartwell farm. The skeletal remains of burned barns dotted the landscape like tombstones, a grim reminder of the fires that had plagued the valley for months. Jake had been ranching these lands for 15 years, ever since he'd inherited the sprawling Morrison Ranch from his grandfather. He'd seen drought, floods, and cattle disease, but nothing like the systematic destruction that had befallen his neighbors. 7 farms had burned in as many weeks, each fire more devastating than the last. The town council blamed faulty wiring, dry conditions, anything that would keep the insurance companies paying and the federal investigators away. But Jake knew better. He'd seen the patterns, the way the fires always started on the night of the new moon, the way they consumed everything except for strange circular patches of earth that remained untouched, as if protected by some invisible force. The authorities dismissed his observations as the ravings of a simple rancher, but Jake's grandfather had taught him to read the signs that others missed. As he crested a hill overlooking the old quarry, a sound stopped him cold, a woman's voice, desperate and raw with terror, carried on the wind like a prayer to an indifferent god. "Please, I'm begging you, don't let them find me." Jake spurred his horse toward the sound, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle secured to his saddle. Below, in the shadow of the abandoned quarry walls, he saw her, a woman in a torn black dress, her wild auburn hair streaming behind her as she stumbled to the rocky terrain. Behind her, maybe half a mile back, torches bobbed like angry fireflies in the darkness. The mob was gaining ground. "Ma'am," Jake called out, dismounting quickly. "Ma'am, up here." The woman looked up, her face pale as moonlight, eyes wide with terror so profound it made Jake's blood run cold. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, with sharp cheekbones and lips that might have been beautiful if they weren't twisted in desperation. "They're coming," she gasped, stumbling up the rocky slope toward him. "They'll kill me if they catch me. Please, I know what you must think, but I swear to you, I never hurt anyone." "Who's coming?" Jake asked, though he could already hear the shouts growing closer, the angry voices of men he'd known all his life. "The whole town," she whispered, collapsing against a boulder. "They think they know what I am." Jake looked back at the approaching torches, then at the woman before him. Her dress was singed at the edges, and there were burn marks on her hands that looked like they'd been made by rope. Someone had tried to tie her up. Someone had tried to burn her. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Elena Blackthorne," she replied, and the name hit Jake like a physical blow. Every child in Millbrook Valley had heard the stories of the Blackthorne family, the old tales of witchcraft and devil worship that had supposedly ended when the last of the family had been driven out 50 years ago. "You're supposed to be dead," Jake said, not unkindly, just stating what everyone in town believed. Elena laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "My grandmother was driven out,
It's a
not
lifeline
killed.
in this
She made a
arid
new life in
world,
the mountains,
a
had a
symbol
daughter
of the
who had
beauty
me.
that
But
still
when the fire started,
exists
when
despite
people began
the
to whisper about
darkness.
curses and old
And
magic,
in that
they
moment,
remembered the
as
old
the
stories.
last sliver
They
of
remembered the
sunlight
Blackthorne
fades
name.
away, we
The
know
torches were
that
closer
whatever
now,
decision he
close
makes,
enough that Jake could
it
make
will
out
be a
individual
choice
faces.
that defines
Tom
not
Bradley
only
from the
his
hardware
fate,
store, Pastor
but
Williams,
the very
even
soul
Mayor
of
Hutchins,
the Wild
men he'd
West.
known since childhood, now transformed into something ugly and primitive by fear and superstition. "Did you start the fires?" Jake asked directly. Elena's eyes flashed with anger. "No. I came back to Millbrook to find answers, to understand why my family was really driven out. But someone else is behind the fires, someone who wants the blame to fall on me. They're using the old fears, the old hatred, to cover up something much worse." Jake made his decision in that moment, though he couldn't have said why. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, with hope instead of the calculating manipulation he'd expected from a witch. Maybe it was the fact that the men hunting her looked more like monsters than she did. Or maybe it was something his grandfather had once told him about the real nature of good and evil. "Can you ride?" he asked. Relief flooded her features. "Yes." "Then get on the horse. We're going to my ranch." As Elena climbed onto his horse with surprising grace, Jake could hear Tom Bradley's voice echoing off the quarry walls. She went this way. The witch went this way. Jake swung up behind Elena, feeling the warmth of her body against his chest, smelling the scent of wood smoke and something else, something like herbs and wild honey. As they rode hard across the valley floor, Elena turned slightly in the saddle. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a long moment, listening to the fading shouts behind them, because he finally said, "I've got a feeling that if they catch you, the real monster stays free." The Morrison Ranch sat like a fortress against the darkness, its sprawling main house and outbuildings protected by miles of fence, and the kind of isolation that had always suited Jake just fine. He'd built his life around solitude and the honest work of raising cattle. But as he helped Elena down from his horse in the barn, he realized that solitude was about to become a luxury he couldn't afford. "They'll come here," Elena said, her voice steadier now, but still edged with fear. "When they can't find me anywhere else, they'll come here." Jake secured his horse and checked the barn doors. "Let them come. This is my land, and I don't take kindly to mobs." Elena studied him in the lamplight, her green eyes searching his face as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You don't believe I'm a witch." "I don't believe you're evil," Jake corrected, leading her toward the house. "As for the other part, well, I've seen enough strange things in my life to keep an open mind." The main house was a testament to 3 generations of Morrison men who'd valued function over form. The furniture was sturdy and well-worn, the walls lined with books that Jake's grandfather collected from all over the world. It was a house that had seen its share of secrets, and Jake had a feeling it was about to see one more. He settled Elena in the kitchen, putting coffee on to brew while she cleaned her burns at the sink. In the lamplight, away from the terror of the chase, he could see her more clearly. She was beautiful, but it was a sharp, wild kind of beauty that spoke of storms and untamed places. Her hands, as she gently washed the rope burns, moved with a precision that suggested someone accustomed to working with plants and herbs. "Tell me about the fires," Jake said, settling across from her at the heavy oak table. Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the mug as if drawing warmth from more than just a liquid. "I came back to Millbrook 6 weeks ago," she began. "I'd been living with my aunt in Colorado, but when she died last year, she left me some papers, letters, documents, things my grandmother had hidden before she was forced to leave." "What kind of documents?" Elena hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "Records of payments. My great-grandmother kept meticulous books of her services. She was what you might call a wise woman. People came to her for healing, for help with crops, for advice about love and loss. But someone was paying her for something else, something she recorded in code." Jake leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "What kind of something else?" "Protection," Elena said quietly. "Someone in this town was paying my family to keep a secret buried. The payment stopped a year before the family was driven out." Before Jake could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. Elena went rigid, her coffee cup clattering against the table. Jake moved to the window, peering through the curtains at the line of torches winding up his drive. 15 men, he murmured. "Maybe 20. Jake Morrison." Tom Bradley's voice carried across the night air. "We know she's here. Send out the witch, and nobody gets hurt." Jake felt Elena's hand on his arm, felt the trembling she was trying to hide. "I won't let you get hurt because of me," she whispered. "I'll go with them." "Like hell you will," Jake said grimly. He moved to a cabinet and withdrew a shotgun, checking to make sure it was loaded. Tom Bradley and his friends are about to learn the difference between town law and ranch law. Jake stepped onto his front porch, the shotgun cradled in his arms, but not pointing at anyone in particular. The mob had stopped about 50 feet from the house, their torches casting dancing shadows across the yard. He recognized most of the faces, men he'd done business with, shared drinks with, called friends. "That's far enough," Jake called out. "This is private property." "Jake, be reasonable." Mayor Hutchins stepped forward, his politician's smile looking grotesque in the torchlight. "We're not here to cause trouble for you. Just hand over the Blackthorn woman, and we'll be on our way." "What makes you think she's here?" "Don't play games," Tom Bradley snarled. "We tracked her to quarry and saw 2 riders heading this way. Where else would she go?" Jake let his gaze move slowly across the assembled men, noting who was there and, more importantly, who wasn't. I see a lot of familiar faces out there. Men who've been losing sleep over these fires, losing friends and neighbors. But I notice some folks are missing from your little party. What's that supposed to mean? Pastor Williams demanded. Just wondering why certain prominent citizens aren't here. Jake said casually. Mr. Pemberton from the bank, for instance. Or Mr. Ashford, who owns half the land in the valley. Seems like they'd be mighty interested in catching the person responsible for all this destruction. He saw several men exchange glances, saw doubt beginning to creep into some faces. Jake pressed his advantage. You know what I think, he continued. I think you're all so scared and angry that you're ready to burn an innocent woman just to feel like you're doing something. But the real question is, who told you she was the one to blame? Everyone knows the stories about her family, Tom Bradley said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Stories, Jake repeated. 50-year-old stories about things none of you actually saw. But these fires, these are real. And while you're out here chasing shadows, whoever's really responsible is probably getting ready to strike again. Elena appeared in the doorway behind Jake, and the mob stirred restlessly. But instead of cowering, she stood straight and proud, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. Jake's right, she called out. I didn't start these fires, but I know who did. And if you kill me tonight, you'll never learn the truth about what's really been happening in your town. It's a trick, someone shouted from the back of the crowd. Then test me, Elena challenged. Ask me something only the real fire starter would know. The crowd fell silent, uncertainty replacing anger. Jake felt the tide beginning to turn, but he also sensed something else, a watching presence in the darkness beyond the torches, something that didn't want Elena to speak. The standoff stretched through the long hours until dawn, with the mob eventually retreating but not disbanding. Jake knew they'd be back, probably with reinforcements, and whatever Elena knew about the fires had to be worth the risk they were both taking. As the sun rose over Millbrook Valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Elena sat at Jake's kitchen table with a collection of documents spread before her. Her great-grandmother's papers told a story that reached back nearly a century, a tale of corruption and cover-up that made the supernatural seem almost mundane by comparison. It started with a mine, Elena explained, pointing to a faded map that showed property boundaries from the 1920s. There was a silver mine in the hills above town, owned by a man named Cornelius Ashford. It made the family fortune, but it also made them desperate to hide what they'd found down there. Jake studied the map, noting how the Ashford property connected to several other prominent families' lands. What did they find? Bodies, Elena said quietly. The mine had been built on an old burial ground. Not just any burial ground, but the final resting place of an entire Indian tribe that had been massacred by early settlers. The Ashfords found evidence of the massacre when they were digging, evidence that would have implicated several founding families in genocide. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. So they paid your family to keep quiet. More than that, they paid my great-grandmother to use her knowledge of herbs and natural processes to accelerate the decomposition, to make the evidence disappear. She took their money because her family was starving, but she kept records of everything as insurance. Jake poured himself another cup of coffee, his mind racing. But something went wrong. Elena nodded grimly. The mine flooded in 1934. My great-grandmother told the Ashfords that the water would eventually carry the contamination into the underground springs that fed the whole valley. She demanded they pay for proper cleanup, threatened to expose everything if they didn't. So they had her driven out instead. They orchestrated the whole witch hunt, spread stories, staged supernatural events, turned the whole town against my family. It was easier than paying for a cleanup that would have bankrupted them. Jake walked to the window, looking out at the valley that had been his family's home for generations. And now the contamination is finally reaching the surface. The fires aren't supernatural. They're caused by gases seeping up from the flooded mine. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, other chemicals that ignite when they hit the right concentration in the air. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. That's why the fires follow a pattern. That's why they leave those circular patches of untouched ground. Exactly. The gas vents follow the underground water table. But the current generation of Ashfords and their business partners can't afford to have the truth come out, so they brought me back. Jake turned to stare at her. They brought you back? Elena's smile was bitter. Oh, yes. They made sure I'd hear about the fires. Made sure I'd come back to investigate. They needed a scapegoat, and what better choice than the descendant of the original Blackthorn Witch? They've been feeding the mob's fears, making sure everyone knows I'm here, making sure the blame falls on me instead of on a real cause. But if you die, the evidence dies with you. No, Elena said, gathering up the papers. That's where they miscalculated. Before I came back, I made copies of everything and left them with a lawyer in Denver. If anything happens to me, the whole story goes to the state attorney general. Jake heard the sound of approaching vehicles and moved back to the window. Looks like our friends are back, and they brought the sheriff. Elena joined him at the window, and Jake felt her stiffen beside him. That's not the sheriff, she said quietly. That's Harold Ashford himself. The procession that wound up Jake's drive looked more official than the previous night's mob. There were fewer torches and more badges, fewer pitchforks and more guns. Harold Ashford, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and expensive clothes, stood beside a black sedan while uniformed deputies deployed around the house. Jake Morrison, Ashford called out, his voice carrying the authority of old money and political connections. I'm here as a duly appointed representative of the county commission. You're harboring a fugitive suspected of arson and murder. Surrender her immediately, and no charges will be filed against you. Jake stepped onto his porch, noting how the deputies' hands rested on their weapons. What murder? Tom Bradley was found dead this morning, Ashford replied. Burned alive in his own store. The witch's work, obviously. Elena appeared beside Jake, and he felt her shock like a physical force. I've been here all night, she called out. Jake can vouch for that. The word of one man protecting a witch, Ashford said dismissively. Hardly reliable testimony. But Jake was studying the faces of the deputies, men he'd known for years, and he saw doubt there. Tom Bradley's death changed everything. It proved that the fires would continue even with Elena captured. More importantly, it proved that someone else was pulling the strings. Funny thing, Jake called out, if Elena here is responsible for the fires, and she's been in my house all night, then how did Tom Bradley end up dead? Several deputies exchanged glances, and Jake pressed his advantage. Unless, he continued, there's someone else involved. Someone who needed Tom Bradley silenced before he could ask too many questions. Ashford's face darkened. Enough games. Deputies, arrest them both. But as the deputies moved forward, Elena stepped to the edge of the porch and raised her voice. Harold Ashford, you and your family have been poisoning this valley for 90 years. The fires aren't supernatural. They're caused by chemical contamination from your grandfather's mine. The deputies stopped, confusion replacing certainty. One of them, a young man Jake recognized as Billy Henderson, lowered his gun entirely. What's she talking about, Mr. Ashford? Billy asked. Ashford's composure cracked slightly. The ravings of a desperate woman. Don't listen to her lies. But Elena was already pulling out documents, holding them high enough for everyone to see. I have the records. I have proof that the Ashford family has known about the contamination for decades and done nothing to stop it. The truth hung in the morning air like smoke from a dying fire. Jake saw the moment when the deputies realized they'd been used, saw the anger begin to replace confusion in their faces. Harold Ashford saw it too, and his hand moved toward his coat. That's when Jake realized the older man wasn't going to let either of them live to testify. The gun appeared in Harold Ashford's hand with the smooth efficiency of someone who'd killed before, but Jake was already moving, pulling Elena behind a solid oak pillar that supported his porch roof. The bullet splintered inches from his head, and suddenly the morning erupted into chaos. He's got a gun, Billy Henderson shouted, and Jake heard the distinctive sound of deputies drawing their own weapons. But they weren't aiming at Jake and Elena anymore. They were aiming at Harold Ashford. Put it down, Mr. Ashford, another deputy yelled. Put the weapon down. But Ashford was beyond reasoning now, his carefully constructed facade crumbling like the flood-damaged mine that had started it all. "You don't understand," he screamed, swinging the gun wildly between Jake and the deputies. "If this gets out, it'll destroy everything. My family built this town." "Your family poisoned this town," Elena called out from behind the pillar. "And you've been covering it up with murder." Jake peered around the pillar and saw the older man's face, twisted with decades of buried guilt and desperation. "Tom Bradley figured it out, didn't he?" Jake called out. He started asking questions about why the fires followed the old mine surveys. "So you killed him and tried to make it look like Elena's work." "Tom was weak," Ashford snarled, just like his father before him. The Bradleys always asked too many questions. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Jake saw several deputies exchange glances, saw the realization dawning that they'd been part of something much darker than witch hunting. "How many others?" Billy Henderson asked quietly. "How many people have died to keep your secret?" Ashford's laugh was bitter and broken. "You want to know the truth? The truth is that this town was built on blood and bones, and it stayed prosperous by keeping those bones buried. My family didn't start the killing. We just continued it." Elena stepped out from behind the pillar, her fear replaced by a righteous anger that seemed to make her glow in the morning light. "The massacre of the Cherokee Band in 1847, she said. Your ancestor Jeremiah Ashford led that raid, didn't he? And when they found gold and silver on the burial ground, they built their mine right on top of the graves." "It was a different time," Ashford said weakly, but the gun was wavering in his hand now. "It's still the same crimes," Jake said, stepping out beside Elena. "Still the same cover-up. Still the same willingness to kill innocent people, to protect your family's reputation." Ashford's eyes darted between them and the advancing deputies, and Jake could see the moment when desperation turned to calculation. "You think you've won," the older man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But there are others, other families with secrets to protect. Kill me, and you'll never know how deep this goes." "We'll take our chances," Elena said firmly. That's when Harold Ashford made his final play. Instead of surrendering or continuing to threaten them, he turned a gun on himself, but not to commit suicide. Instead, he fired into the ground at his feet, and Jake heard a sound he'd been dreading, the soft whoosh of igniting gas. The contamination had spread farther than Elena had realized. Even here, on Jake's property, the poisoned groundwater was close enough to the surface to create pockets of flammable gas. Ashford's bullet had found one of those pockets, and now blue flames began to lick up from the earth around his feet. "Everyone back!" Jake shouted, but it was too late. The fire spread along invisible underground channels, following contamination like a fuse toward a powder keg. Within seconds, flames erupted in a dozen places across the yard. Harold Ashford stood in the middle of the inferno, his expensive clothes beginning to smoke, but he was laughing, a mad, triumphant sound that chilled Jake to the bone. "You want to expose the truth?" he screamed over the roar of flames. "Then burn with it." But Elena was already in motion. She ran not away from the fire, but toward it, pulling a small leather pouch from her dress pocket. Jake started to follow her, but she waved him back. "Trust me," she called out. "This is what my family really knew." Jake watched in amazement as Elena began to scatter some kind of powder around the flames, speaking words in a language he didn't recognize. It wasn't magic in any supernatural sense. It was chemistry, knowledge passed down through generations of women who'd learned to work with the natural world rather than against it. The flames began to die back, the chemical reaction neutralized by whatever Elena was using. Jake realized that her great-grandmother's real gift hadn't been witchcraft. It had been an intuitive understanding of chemistry and geology that had made her invaluable to the Ashfords and dangerous to their secrets. Harold Ashford stared in disbelief as the flames around him sputtered and died. He raised his gun again, this time clearly intending to shoot Elena, but Billy Henderson was faster. The young deputy's shot took Ashford in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon flying. As the older man fell to his knees in the smoking grass, Jake heard him whisper something that made his blood run cold. "It doesn't matter. The contamination goes deeper than you know. It's in the water table now, in the foundations of every building in town. You can't stop what's already begun. Elena knelt beside the wounded man, her anger replaced by something that looked almost like pity. "You're right," she said quietly. "We can't undo 90 years of poisoning overnight, but we can stop the lies. We can finally tell the truth." She stood and turned to face the assembled deputies, the documents still clutched in her hand. "The fires will continue until the contamination is properly cleaned up. It'll take years and millions of dollars, but it can be done. The question is whether this town is finally ready to face its past." Jake moved to stand beside her, looking out the valley that had been his family's home for 3 generations. The sun was fully up now, burning away the morning mist and revealing the full extent of the damage. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from what might have been another spontaneous fire, or might have been another building burning down. "What happens now?" Billy Henderson asked, helping his fellow deputy secure Harold Ashford. "Now we tell everyone the truth," Elena said. "All of it. The massacre, the cover-up, the contamination, everything. And then we start the long work of making it right." Jake felt her hand slip into his, felt the calluses that spoke of hard work and dedication. "Will you stay?" he asked quietly. "To see it through?" Elena looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd found her running through the darkness, she smiled. "I spent my whole life running for my family's legacy," she said. "Maybe it's time I started embracing it instead." As the deputies led Harold Ashford away and the morning sun climbed higher over Millbrook Valley, Jake realized that the real story was just beginning. The fires might continue for a while longer, and cleaning up 90 years of contamination would be a monumental task. But for the first time in generations, the truth was finally coming to light.